Nowhere does a practice that ignores all pure rational principles deny theory so arrogantly as in the question of what is required for a good constitution of a state. The cause is that a lawful constitution of long standing gradually accustoms the people to a rule of appraising its happiness as well as its rights in terms of the condition in which everything up to now has followed its quiet course, but not, conversely, to evaluate that condition in terms of the concepts of both provided by reason. Instead, it leads the people always to prefer that passive condition to the dangerous situation of seeking a better one. What Hippocrates told physicians to take to heart holds here: judicium anceps, experimentum periculosum. Immanuel Kant. I want to discuss in this lecture and also in the upcoming ones what Kant has to say about states' right, which is the first of the three levels of public rights. So the right within one state. The next level would be the nation's right, so what today is called international law, the rights between states. And then we have cosmopolitan right, which you could say is sort of the general human right. To that I will get at a later point. But first, the states' right. There is, of course, various things, various aspects of the state that could be discussed. What should be the system of punishments for crimes? How exactly should the state function? Who should be in charge? And what do we do if the state is an unjust state, is a despotic state? How can we change that? Should there be a revolution, or should there be some other means of improving the state? All of this I do want to discuss in upcoming lectures. On all of these questions, Kant gives answers. But before I do that, what I want to do first here in this lecture is discuss in general what is the job of the state. What is the state there for? Because all the other questions on how exactly should the state function, of course, can only be answered properly if we know what the state is all about. And well, to Kant, the answer is quite simple, and I've already talked about this topic from various sides in previous lectures. Right in general is about what he calls the mine and yours, so about property. It could be the innate rights, so that which is mine by birth, like my body, or could be the acquired rights, that which becomes my property at some point, like my house or whatever. But the right is about property, about securing that. And I said in my lecture on what is justice that in the state of nature, so when there's no state, no laws, this is not secured. I can claim something as my right here, I can claim something as my property, but it is just provisional property. It is not true property because I have no guarantee that others will respect this claim of mine. Just like I might not respect their claims to certain property. So therefore, I said, we need to leave the state of nature, we need to enter a state of public right, where everyone's property is secured, is guaranteed. And that is precisely the job of the state. The state has to protect the people's rights, which means their right to their property, their exclusive right to what is theirs, in order to create peace, to end this eternal war of all against all that is the state of nature, and rather create a perpetual peace between people, because everyone has what is his, and it stays his. It is guaranteed as his. And in this sense, the public right, as I already said in the lecture on justice, is a distributive justice. Because, and here's the important point I want to make here in this lecture, Kant says the state must be viewed as the original owner of all the property of all the people within the state, who then distributes it to the individual people. So we have to think of it as there being a universal will. The will not of a specific individual, but the will of the people, of the whole people of the state. And this will owns everything within the state and then distributes it to the specific individuals. So if we go with the ground, since, as I talked about in my lecture on the original acquisition and the theory of the ground, Kant would say that all property starts with the ground, with owning the ground, and then you can own what is on this ground, what this ground produces. If we start with the ground, originally, you cannot say that a piece of ground belongs to this person or a piece of ground belongs to that person. Because again, one person can of course claim a piece of ground, can put a fence around it, but the other person won't necessarily respect it. Just like the first person will probably not respect the other person claiming a piece of ground. So originally, you have to think of both of them together owning the whole ground. The ground not being owned by an individual, but by the universal will of all. And now, from this universal will, they can distribute the ground. They can both agree, since they both would like to have some piece of ground to be exclusively theirs, they can both agree to carve up what they own together and to say, okay, we both have ownership of both pieces of ground, but now we agree that this part, which we own both, will henceforth be used exclusively by you, and I will stay away from this part of the ground. And on the other hand, this other part of ground will be exclusively mine, and you will stay away from it. So, in this sense, once again, there is no property outside or before the state, just provisional property, just things that people might claim as theirs, but it's not guaranteed that it will stay theirs. And only through the state, who is the true and original owner of everything, only through the state distributing it, and through its laws obliging all the citizens except one to stay away from the object. That is the meaning of this one citizen owning that object. Just like the state obliges all the citizens, including this one, except another one, to stay away from another object. Only through this does true property come into being. And this is a very important remark and insight of Kant's. Because I already mentioned in the lecture on what is justice that people, that the unaufkläred people, they tend to have this at least latent anti-etatism. So they are always enemies of the state. And so you do have people who are enemies of the state more consciously and more honestly, who actually make this their political ideology. You have, of course, some open anarchists on the left. And on this, you can say that they are at least consistent to some degree, because they don't just want to abolish the state, they also want to abolish property. They will say stuff like property is theft. So while that is wrong, while I disagree with that, and so would Kant, and I already gave a lecture on why there must be property, because otherwise the reason itself would be restricted, otherwise it could not act reasonably in the world. You have to at least acknowledge that these people are somewhat consistent, that they realize that there's a connection between the state and property, and you cannot abolish one without the other. But these people nowadays are also very marginal and don't matter much politically. On the other hand, however, you have these liberal or even libertarian people who are much more influential politically. Even if they may not be a majority, they certainly have influence. Even at least in Argentina, having the presidency. And these are the kinds of people that will also say they want to abolish the state, more or less. I mean, some go as far as to wanting to completely get rid of the state and privatize everything. So their vision is living in a world that it's some sort of crossover between Wild West, Mad Max, and Monopoly. But they don't want to abolish property. Quite the contrary, they love property. They are these ultra capitalists, and they will just envision a world where everything is privatized. Right? I have known such people myself, who might even go as far as to saying there should not be a police force by the state that is paid through taxes, because taxes are theft to these people. But rather they will say, oh, you can live in a world without a state, and then there could be private security firms, and you can voluntarily subscribe to one, and then you would pay a monthly fee for them to protect you. But they will say there's more liberty here than in our states, because you're not forced to pay taxes. You can also choose to not subscribe to a security firm and just protect yourself with your own gun. And even if you do subscribe, there's a free market, right? So there's not just one police force, but you can choose whose company's service you think is best. Of course, this is so utterly stupid that it does not deserve being discussed in a philosophical context. I mean, these people could never explain how they would. So first off, how would they pay these companies? Like, why would there be money? Who would guarantee that there is money, and that money actually has value, and that this money is accepted by everyone if there's no state? But okay, fair enough. They will probably talk some bullshit about cryptocurrencies or whatever. But even more importantly, they can never explain how would they make sure that these security companies don't end up turning into the mafia and just forcing people to pay protection money. Like, if there's no state, who would prevent them from forcing people to subscribe to them in order to be protected, and to be protected mainly from themselves? And then further down the line, how would you prevent this system from simply turning into feudalism, and then eventually these companies turning into the new states? But I mean, these libertarians, it's not that they really want to go back to the state of nature, that they really don't want to live in a state. I mean, if they wanted to do that, if that was so great in their mind, why don't they move to Somalia or, I don't know, some parts of Mexico where drug cartels rule and the state has no power? Seems that they don't actually want that. What they do want, and I already previously discussed that in the lecture on what is justice, Kant says that people do want the state of nature to be abolished. They do want there to be laws. They just want to be the exception. They just want there to be no laws or no taxes for themselves, but for everyone else. That would be their ideal situation. But anyways, such libertarians might, while they are influential, they might be an extreme minority. But I would posit that their posture is very widespread. That actually the majority has a similar posture, even if they don't go quite as far. So most people share these views in principle. The difference is just in degree. And degrees don't concern the philosopher. The non-philosopher, because he's focused on the empirical, so what can be observed, will think that some people's opinions are very different, because there might be a large difference in degree, in how extreme they are. But the philosopher is not empirical. The philosopher thinks, and what can be sought are principles. So the philosopher asks, what is someone's principle? Not how consistent is he with it, to what degree does he live that principle. That is secondary. Most people nowadays have this liberal mindset. You just have to hear them complain about taxes and fees and whatever else they have to pay. Many have this, even if they don't outright articulate it, at least sentiment that taxes are theft, that the state is stealing something from them. So something which is theirs, and now the state takes it away and makes it his, and this is somehow unjust. You just have to listen to their resentful tone. Or you have to hear them talk about their rights. Whenever they feel that their rights, their freedom, their property is threatened, for example, their right to destroy the environment, right? When people feel that their cars are being taken away, which of course is not even happening. No one is taking away their cars, unfortunately. But when they feel that this is happening, they will go on how, well, if you don't like cars, you can go with a bike, you climate activists, but this is my car and it is my right to drive around in it however I want. As if driving around in it would not violate the rights of other people by destroying the climate. So the point is that behind this, there's a certain posture. Even if people are not conscious of it or don't properly articulate it, they basically feel like they are still in the state of nature, or like they ought to be. Like the state of nature is the only just state, and they feel as if they have what is theirs: the money on their bank account, their house, their car, their TV, their phone, like they have it already in the state of nature and independently of living in a state. And now afterwards, the state comes along and, like some robber, demands a share of what is already theirs. Of course, this is not the case. if they really were in the state of nature, none of their property was secure. I mean, their car is only their car because the state protects it. If there was no state, anyone could steal their car, anyone could break into their house. But on an even more fundamental level, how would they even have a car? I mean, if there was no state that was collecting taxes, then there would probably be no votes. So you couldn't really drive around with a car. And also there would not be our economy that we have. I mean, the money that these people have, how did they get that money? Probably because they're employed at some company. Well, that company probably relies on there being a state that guarantees the value of the money, a state that makes their whole logistics possible by providing the infrastructure, once again, by building roads, for example, or building airports or whatever. Without the state, none of this would work. And also, why are these people even employed? Why does the company want them? Why do they have competence to work there? Probably because they went to school, because they went to university. How would that have been possible without a state? Even if you don't happen to live in a pauper state, but are unlucky enough to live in the US, where you actually have to get poor and actually have to take a loan to take your human right and study at the university. But even there, the university would hardly be possible without the state. So, but that's how these people see the state. And likewise, the other people around them, they tend to not see them as fellow citizens who are part of the same state, the same community, the same commonwealth, in which they all are members of a shared whole. No, they tend to see these other people around them as random individuals disconnected from everyone else, and they see themselves as random individuals disconnected from everyone else. And they essentially seem to think that they are still in the state of nature with these other human beings, and therefore in a state of constant, at least potential war, in a state of constant competition. And they may accept some people being around them because maybe they can't get rid of them, or maybe they don't want them because these people are useful for them, because it's their employer who pays them, or because it's their friends and family. But then there are other people, immigrants or people of the wrong faith, or people of the wrong sexuality, or people of the wrong opinion, activists that they don't like, whose presence they don't accept and tolerate, whom they want to get rid of, whom they might attack. And to these people, with this sort of libertarian, anarchic mindset, these people who, in Kant's terms, are barbarians, or at least half barbarians. I talked about this in the lecture on what is justice, that the people who have hatred for the law, who want to stay in the state of nature, who have this rebellious mind, these are barbarians. And so these people are half barbarians because they might not outright fight against the state in most cases, because okay, the state is too strong, they understand that they cannot get rid of it, but still they, at least in their mind, in their attitude, they are rebellious. They don't truly accept the state, because to them the state is like some usurper, like some occupier, like everything, the people living alongside each other and the property that the people have was already there and could be there without the state, and now the state comes as the superstructure and take some of their money as taxes. But that's the wrong way to look at it. And with Kant, we can very easily answer to these people. Of course, they will not accept the answer. I'm not saying you can refute them in a way that they would actually change their mind, because people don't change opinions that don't come out of reason because of reasonable arguments. What was not arrived at through rationality, they will not let go because of rationality. So if you wanted to change their opinion, you would first have to change their hearts. You would first have to aufklären them. But while we may not convince them, we at least can understand ourselves that these people are wrong. That the property they don't have independently of the state, and now the state, this annoying presumptuous state, takes some of it away, but rather independently of the state they would have nothing. In the state of nature, you don't have property. You can own something temporarily and provisionally. You can claim it for yourself, but it's never secure. Others could take it away. So the better way to look at it is that the state owns everything and now distributes parts to everyone. And so taxes is not the state taking a part of what you own away, but rather taxes is the state not giving you a part of what he already owns, because he needs this part himself. This is based on Kant's general statement that the state, that the universal will of the people, must be considered as the original owner, who then distributes the things it owns to particular individuals. But Kant goes a step further. Kant is more concrete than that, and he says that particularly the state has to be considered the original owner of the ground. Once again, I already gave a lecture on the original acquisition and the theory of the ground. I already explained that to Kant, all property is derived originally from the ground, from us first owning the ground and then thereby owning what is on the ground. So the state must be considered the original owner and distributor of the ground. And in this distribution of property, the state owns everything, but the state cannot distribute everything. The state can only distribute parts. Kant says that which belongs to the substance of the state cannot give away. That which is necessary for the life, for the existence, for the power of the state after all should have the monopoly of power. There should be no one, no person, no group, no company that has power besides the state, let alone over the state. So that which is needed for the life, the existence, the power of the state, that mustn't ever be given away. Rather, it must be owned by the state itself or by the sovereign of the state. Now, what exactly Kant has to say about sovereignty, I will get into in an upcoming lecture, in my lecture on the division of powers. But here it's enough to say that to him the sovereign is the overlord. The sovereign is he who is ultimately the master of the state, the ruler, he who gives the laws. Now that role could be filled in by different persons. It could be filled in by one person in a monarchy, or by a senate in an aristocracy, or by the people as a whole in democracy. What is important here for our purposes is not who is the sovereign. That's a discussion for another time. but simply that which belongs to the substance of the state is owned not by any individual citizen, but by the sovereign. And even the sovereign cannot just use it however he wants, but rather when the sovereignty passes on, this property must also be passed on, right? So when the king dies and the prince becomes king, or in the case of democracy, there's also a passing on of sovereignty, right? With every new generation, the old people dies out and new citizens are born. And what belongs to the substance of the state must be passed on. It must not be touched, it must not be destroyed, it must not be used up. What does Kant mean by that? What belongs to the substance of the state? Well, he says at some point it's about the basic resources. So it is that, Kant would say, of which there can be general use and not a particular use, right? So if you have a car, you have a particular use of that car. One specific individual can get into that car and drive around with it, which is also why the car can be private property. But if you have a source of water, if you have a well, there can be general use. Everyone can take water from there. And for that reason, it mustn't be owned by a private individual. Another way to define it is that Kant says he is talking about the products of nature as opposed to the products of culture, right? So nature, I mean, it comes from the Latin word for being born, right? Natality. So nature is whatever is born, so to say. So nature is that which is the way it is, well, by nature, by the way it came into being, not because humans made it so. While culture, right, to cultivate means to work on something, to give it a certain form, like agriculture, where you work on the land. And therefore, if you have a product of culture, let's say you have a wooden table or a wooden chair or whatever, that can be owned by a private individual. But the product of nature, so let's stay with this example, let's say the wood, let's say the tree that just grew in nature, which was not yet cultivated and formed by any human being, that should not be owned by a private individual. Yet another definition that Kant gives is that at some point he says the state as such, or the sovereign, should own the elements. And here Kant goes with the old classical teaching of the four elements. So he says the state should own the air, the water, the earth, and the fire. What does Kant mean by that? Well, owning the air, maybe we can put that aside, because the air cannot be owned by a private individual anyway. So maybe you could say that nowadays, this was of course not a topic in Kant days yet, but nowadays with the levels of air pollution we have, we could maybe use this as grounds to say, well, the state owns the air, so if private individuals or companies pollute the air too much, that is an attack on the state, on the state's sovereignty, on the state's property. But more important to Kant are the other three elements. So the state should own the water. By this, Kant means rivers, sources, wells, ponds, lakes. These should not be owned by private citizens or companies. So again, And this is needed for the sovereignty of the state, and this is needed for the survival of the state, of the commonwealth, of the people, right? So Kant would say certainly that it is highly unjust that in our days we have a company like Nestle buying up sources and wells in Africa so that people cannot access the water that they have in their own village without paying money. This, of course, takes the sovereignty, the self-determination from these people away, right? Including the politics. Like the village may have a local mayor or whatever, but he's not in charge anymore of the substance of that which is needed for the survival of his own community. Also, the state should own the earth, Kant says. By this he means the ground itself. So the state cannot give away every piece of ground to individuals so that nothing is left, because when there's a new individual, like a new kid being born, if everyone happened to say to that individual, I don't want you on my private property, then where could he be? Where could he stand? So there needs to be, so to say, public ground, right? Like the streets, the roads, where everyone is allowed to stand. But saying that the state should own the earth, by that Kant doesn't simply mean the ground as such, but also what is in the ground. So resources like the metals that you find in the earth, right? And lastly, you have the fire. And this might sound most strange to say the state should own the fire. How can it own the fire? But of course, Kant means this in more of a metaphorical sense. He's just going with the classical doctrine of the four elements, and that's why he uses the word fire. What Kant means is the means of producing the fire. So in his day, that is basically the wood, right? The wood should not be privately owned because the people in general, and therefore the state, need fire for heating, for cooking, and therefore for survival. And this was an important topic in Kant's day that I think modern people, when reading that part of his writings, will probably fail to appreciate. Having wood, having firewood was really important, of course, especially in winter. And it was a normal part of everyday life. People got paid at wood sometimes, like Kant himself. And this was not just specific to Kant, this was normal for a professor in his day. His payment for being a professor at the university was not only in money, he also got some money, but part of his payment was a specific amount of firewood that he would get. And likewise, when Kant was young, I started this lecture series with a lecture on Kant's biography that you might check out. He himself came from a somewhat poor family, like not super poor, they weren't starving, but they were, his father was a very simple craftsman, and his mother was a very pietist woman, who would go to this preacher Schulz, who worked at the Collegium Fridericianum, the school, the high school, also became the headmaster of that school. It was this preacher who arranged for Kant to go to that school to get an education. And this preacher Schulz, who also came home to the family a few times, because of the family's poverty, he would sometimes arrange for them getting some firewood, which was sort of a tactful way of helping them, right? They would probably not have accepted money as direct charity. They would probably have felt that to be wrong. Again, they weren't so poor that they were starving and begging. But one way to help them was to give them firewood now and then. But the wood, that was a more general problem. In that time, in the 18th century, also already in the 17th century, in Germany, there was the so-called Holznot. Holz meaning wood, and Not meaning something like emergency or scarcity or crisis. So I think it's usually translated as wood crisis. Because ever since the dawn of modernity, the forests had been cut down more and more in Germany. There were less and less forests because so much wood got used. And so wood became ever more scarce. And on top of that, of course, forests were often owned by some noblemen who would not allow people to just go there and cut down woods for themselves, right? And cut down trees for themselves. So in older times, in the Middle Ages, peasants might have had certain privilege, certain rights to go into the forest and collect the wood, collect the branches that had fallen down. They might not have been allowed to cut down a tree, but they could collect branches. But in modernity, more and more they lost these privileges, and even the branches now belonged exclusively to the noblemen. So it was entirely possible for a peasant to live next to a forest, and which must have felt like dying of thirst amidst an ocean, not being able to heat in the winter because he was not allowed to get any of the wood. And this Holznot, this wood crisis, would basically start the environmental movement. I mean, also around Kant's time, around the time of Kant's death, around 1800, you had the Romantics, right? A movement of Romanticism in art, mainly in poetry. And the Romantics were, of course, about turning back to nature and particularly to the wild, the untamed, the natural nature, not these Baroque gardens they had, but, for example, the forest. And here a new appreciation for this nature started. And it is here, after 1800, that you get a movement that is about protecting the forests. So doing forestry in a more sustainable way, saying that we cannot just mindlessly cut down trees till our descendants have no trees left, but rather we must do so in a responsible manner, and we also must replant trees. And since then there has been some reforestation in Germany, and this is sort of a first environmental movement. Of course, then later you get, after the Industrial Revolution, you get many more environmental problems about the environment, the rivers being polluted, about the hole in the ozone layer, till our days when you have the climate crisis. But this wood crisis in more or less all of the German lands, this is sort of the first modern environmental issue that starts the whole thing. And to get an idea for how serious this was, there's one point that I found quite striking in Kant's writing. Close to his death in his last years, he makes some notes about vaccines, which was a new invention at the time, and vaccines against the smallpox were introduced. And Kant in his writings reflects on that, and is it morally okay? Are you morally allowed to risk that to get vaccinated? And the physicians were praising this invention. They were saying, oh, so many children die of the smallpox. This can prevent children dying. And at some point in his notes, Kant says, well, this is basically the physicians praising themselves, praising how smart they are for having come up with this new invention. But no one in the common people, no one amongst the peasants really asked for this invention. The peasants feel the Holznot, so the wood crisis, much more than the Pockennot, the smallpox crisis. And if you had asked them what they want of the learned people, of the scholars, what they would like for them to come up with as a solution to a problem they have, they would probably have rather asked for a solution to the wood crisis. And I think Kant noting this, that people are much more concerned with the wood crisis than with a significant number of their children dying of the smallpox, this can give you an idea of how serious this was. And this, I think, is the background for Kant saying not private individuals, but the state should own the fire. That is the means of producing the fire. And I think it is easy to adapt this to our modern world. I mean, again, Kant says fire because he also wants to go with this, with the classical four elements. But I think it would be within the spirit of his philosophy to say that by fire he means energy. I mean, the word energy in the sense we use it nowadays was not yet introduced in Kant's days, so that's why he, of course, wouldn't have called it that. But I think if he lived today, he would say, yes, that fire should be interpreted as energy. And of course, nowadays, he wouldn't say the state or the sovereign should simply own the wood, but rather this should go for all the means of producing energy, for the coal, for the gas, for the oil. So it should be obvious that these thoughts of Kant, which are not very well known, not very prominently discussed usually, but that they are quite important and quite relevant to the modern age. To all the issues that we had, especially in the last decades, in this time of neoliberalism, with all the privatizing. I think it is quite clear that Kant would say that this capitalist system that we have, I mean, it's not a word he uses yet, right? He died in 1804, so there had been the first early developments of capitalism, but of course the Industrial Revolution had not happened yet. But if we understand capitalism as private ownership of the means of production, of course, that's more of a Marxian way to put it. Again, that's not the kind of language Kant uses. But still, if we understand by capitalism private ownership of the means of production, then Kant would say this is a system where true justice is not possible. If by justice, you can go back to my lecture on what is justice, we understand everyone having what is his, everyone getting what is his, right? Suum quique tribur, give to each his own, is the principle of public right, of public justice to Kant. Because Kant would say, if the state is not truly sovereign, if the state has not truly the monopoly on power, and if the continued survival and sovereignty of the state is not guaranteed, then there can be no justice. Then the state cannot make sure that everyone has what is his by rights, right? If some private company owns the sources, owns the water, then I may die of thirst. Then I don't have what is mine, what should be mine by right. So Kant would say there can be private ownership of products, again, of things of culture, not of nature. There can be private ownership of not resources, but of things made out of resources that have a specific particular use, not a general use. But there cannot be private ownership of that which is needed by the state to be sovereign and to remain in power. It is always unjust, it is always a violation of rights to attack and therefore to privatize, because otherwise you could not legally attack it, to attack that which is needed for the life of the people. So, for example, here in Germany, in the past few years, we had such cases. We had the Hambacher Forst, a forest being cut down for an energy company in order to dig up coal beneath that forest. And we had the village of Lützerath, which had existed since Roman times, but fuck that. People were evicted from there. The whole village was torn down, again, to open the ground and to get to the coal beneath that village. Despite massive protests from organizations like Fridays for Future or Last Generation and so on. And despite us being in a climate crisis, despite the fact we should use less coal and not more of it, and these are cases that are, of course, not specific to Germany. Such things are, of course, happening in other places around the world too, and that is why Kant's thoughts are so relevant. And I want to conclude with one more remark, and that is that in recent years, people have pushed for parts of nature being declared juridical persons. This has already happened in a number of countries, right? Like Canada, like the US, like New Zealand, and parts of South America. There have been, I think, mostly rivers that were declared juridical legal persons. But also in New Zealand, for example, a mountain has been declared a legal person. And in Colombia, actually, the Amazon River has been declared a legal person. And that means that, well, now in front of the law, they are considered like people. They are considered as having certain rights, like a river having the right to flow, the right to not be polluted, the right to exist. And you can now sue people for violating the rights of these parts of nature. And often it is indigenous people who have lived by these rivers or these mountains or forests or whatever, and who have lived in more harmony with nature, and to maybe also consider, for example, this mountain in New Zealand holy. It is often indigenous people who have pushed for that. And to this I want to say that I am all for the purpose for the protection of these parts of nature, these rivers or mountains or forests or whatever. But I can't help but being a philosopher and an Aufklärer, a rationalist. So I have to say that I cannot fully agree with the means to that purpose. Declaring these parts of nature legal persons is, after all, not a purpose in itself. It is a means to achieve something. And I think, coming from Kant, we could understand that the same thing could also be achieved another way, and maybe could even be achieved in a better way. Because, I'm sorry, but it's kind of silly to consider, for example, a river a person. It is not a person. And Kant would insist that only a rational, only an autonomous being can be a person, and therefore can have rights and also duties. The two come together for Kant. He would insist that an item, which is anything, even if it's alive, even if it is an animal, in legal terms, an item is anything that does not have rationality and that does not have autonomy, anything that is not free. He would insist that an item cannot have rights. It also has no duties, right? You can sue someone for violating the river's rights if he pollutes the river, but you cannot sue the river if the river floods a nearby village for violating the people's rights. So that makes no sense to Kant. So, in that sense, saying that by polluting the river, you violate the river's right is as silly as saying that a stone can be a legal person, and if you kick it across the street or if you kick it into a river, you violate the stone's rights. Of course, this is not about religion. This does not prevent these indigenous people from seeing the river as not just a material but also a spiritual thing, containing a sort of soul or spirit that would be a person. That's fine. That's something they can believe, but that's not relevant in legal terms. But I think in legal terms, it would not even be necessary to declare these parts of nature legal persons. I mean, if you go and destroy a car in some way, like if you smash in the car window or if you key the car, you can be sued not because the car as such is a legal person with rights and you violated the car's rights, but because the car is property of an individual and you violated that individual's rights by violating his property. And likewise, instead of having to go with this well-meant but in rational terms somewhat silly measure of declaring such parts of nature to be persons, we could simply declare them property. But not property of this or that individual who can now do with them whatever they want, but rather property of the state, of the sovereign, which in a democracy means of the people as such. And I'm saying this is not just another means to the same end, which works just as well. I'm saying this could work even better. Because for one, we would not have to declare individual rivers or forests persons, where every new time there would be a new fight, should this really be a person? And you would always end up with parts of nature that have not been given person, not been given rights, but rather you could just pass one general law that says, like Kant says, whatever belongs to the substance of the state automatically is owned by the state and cannot be owned by any private person. And second, Right now, if we declare these parts of nature to be persons with rights, then sure, an attack on them is an attack on their individual rights and might be punished as such. Just like if I kill a human being, I will be punished for violating that specific person's rights. If, however, instead they were to be declared an integral part of the state as such, then attacking them would not just be any crime, it would be high treason. It would be crime not against an individual, it would be a crime against the state or against the people as such, and therefore we could punish it with whatever is the highest possible form of punishment that this state's legal system has to offer. Which leads me to one more remark that goes beyond Kant, but that I at least want to make here. Legal theory, including the philosophy of right, including Kant, for the longest time has been used to considering crimes on an individual level. An individual perpetrator violating the rights of an individual victim. Even if he attacks several victims, like mass murder, it's still several individuals that he harmed. And even if there are several perpetrators working together, they are still judged as individuals for what they did individually, right? So if one guy shoots several people down and another guy gave him the gun, wanting him to shoot them down, the other guy will not be punished for murder directly, but just for assisting in the murder. But I think it may be that in the modern age, we have found, and we still are just in the process of finding it, we are maybe still just becoming conscious of this new issue, that there are crimes, especially if you go beyond the state level, if you go to the level of what to Kant is the nation's rights, so international law, there are crimes which are collective crimes. Crimes that might both be committed not against an individual, but against a collective, against a group as a group, not just the individuals in the group, and that might be committed by a collective, like by a whole people, for example. The first such crime, and so far the only one that has been recognized in international law, is of course the crime of genocide, where that's an issue. Many people still view it in this individualistic way, as if genocide meant killing each individual of a given people. But no, it means destroying a people as such. Individuals can even stay alive, but what you are destroying is their group and their possibility of reconstituting themselves as a group. So if you take away their means of reproduction, or if you ethnically cleanse them and spread them into different parts of the earth where they will lose their culture and memory and blend in with the other people amongst whom they now live, you have committed genocide also. Which is precisely right why Israel is committing genocide, where you don't need gas chambers or the intention of killing every individual, but it's enough that Israel wants to get rid of the people in Gaza, wants to ethnically cleanse it, wants to get them into Egypt or Canada or Indonesia for all they care. So the victim here is a group, and of course so are the perpetrators. Genocide is a sort of social crime where a whole society is involved, which is not the case for regular war crimes, right? Where you can have like one rogue unit, a few soldiers, one rogue commander. You don't need the society as such to be involved and to approve. But for genocide, it's not enough to have some woke soldiers. You need a whole society which is behind that. So far, this is the only such crime that has been recognized. But I mean, already we now have the term ecocide for crimes that destroy nature. Of course, it has not yet been recognized in any legal system, to my knowledge. But maybe eventually it will. That's not unlikely. And with ecocide, I mean, especially with the climate crisis, you can also say it's a whole society committing this crime, right? Everyone who steps into an airplane, for example. And it is also, once again, a crime that is committed not against an individual, but against everyone, right? All of humankind suffers from the climate crisis. So this is something that, to my knowledge, no philosopher of right has yet really reflected about, because it is a quite new phenomenon that only comes to very slowly be understood since some decades, since the middle of the last century. And of course, right now, we don't have any philosophers of right. At least I'm not aware of anyone anywhere on earth being a philosopher of right nowadays. But this is something that maybe we should reflect about more. That there are crimes committed by collectives and also crimes that attack the collective, not just an individual. And I think here, while Kant himself did not yet reflect about that, he gives us a starting point. We could, coming from Kant, say that if you attack the environment, if you attack the basic resources, if you attack that which is necessary and which must be sustained for the continuation of humans living in a just system, then this is more than an attack on any individual's rights. And certainly it's not an attack on the rights of an individual which is not even a person, like a river or a mountain, but rather this should be considered and this should be persecuted as a crime against the collective, against all who own it. And all who own it would be, once again, the people of the state as such, or rather at least that. Because I would say in certain cases, like the rainforest, that is the lung of the earth, we would have to go even beyond that, and we would have to say it's not a state like the state of Brazil that can own this. The particular state can just be the custodian of it, but rather it should be considered as being owned by all of humankind and therefore being owned by the UN. But again, this goes beyond Kant. This is just something that could be built on Kant as an answer to modern problems, and therefore that might be discussed further in another place. But here, where I'm giving Kant lectures, I want to end this lecture now, having explained what the state is for according to Kant. It is there to secure property, to actually first give out, distribute, and thereby in a way first create property. Outside the state, there can be provisional property, there can be something you claim as yours, but there's no guarantee it will stay yours. And this is what the state should do: distribute the property as the original owner of the property. But the state cannot distribute that property which he must own in order to remain a functioning state. That cannot be distributed to private individuals. That's the basis for all of state right. And now, as I said in upcoming lectures, I can deal with other specific parts of state right, like the laws of punishment, like who should rule or govern the state and how. and how should you improve the state and the justice in the state and so on. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk Kubilay Altu, Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufklären cause.